Hi everyone, in this video we're doing section 1.5 material from your textbook. And this is kind of a fun section, hopefully it won't take too long. We're talking about different types of bias in this video. And these three types of bias are different from each other. And it's important to know the difference and to keep these three types of bias keep them straight in your head as to what we mean by sampling bias, what we mean by non-response bias, and what we mean by response bias. Know that these terms are referring to different things, and hopefully by the end of this, understand each one. So sampling bias is when the way that you chose to sample the population affected the results. So in other words, you didn't do a very good, truly random sample of your population. That might result in sampling bias. Now, you don't see very many residential landline telephones anymore. They've pretty much gone out of style. Most people no longer have a home phone. Like, I don't actually have a home phone, I just have a cell phone. But there was a time when we were transitioning from having only landline residential telephones to having cell phones, sometime maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s is when this was happening. And so during this little time period, there were some, pollsters who were contacting people by phone, so using the landline residential telephone numbers in the phone book, to ask them like opinion-related polls, right? And I think, what was happening here is that the younger generation, as they were buying houses or moving into apartments and so on, they never bothered having their landline set up if they already had a cell phone. And the older generation, who grew up around landline telephones, they probably were more likely to have a landline and keep that landline active at their residence, right? So younger means probably no landline. And if you were, part of the older generation, that means you would have a landline telephone. And so these opinion polls, whenever they were conducted by just contacting people at random by selecting random phone numbers from the telephone book, they tended to get a lot more older respondents to the survey than younger respondents. And as you know, there's generational differences in opinion about various things, politics, economics, religion, and so forth. So of course, these surveys, if you performed a landline telephone survey in the late 90s or early 2000s, they would almost definitely be affected by the sampling bias, where the opinion, the resulting statistic of the survey, would be skewed towards the older generation's opinion. And then the same thing for internet surveys. The internet was becoming in wide use during the 90s. And if you had conducted a survey over the internet in the 90s, when more young people are learning how to use the internet, and older people who grew up without the internet and were accustomed to life without the internet, were less likely to be online, participating in surveys. An internet survey might have that sampling bias towards the opinion of the younger generation. So anyways, the way you choose to sample your population, that can affect your results. If that is the case, we call it sampling bias. Different type of bias here, we have non-response bias. And in this bias, it means the people choosing to respond answer differently than would be the people who choose not to respond. So just kind of a silly example, maybe if you tried to conduct a survey over email and you asked people, the question like, do you read every email that you receive? Okay, so maybe there's two types of people in the world. There's people who keep up with their email inbox and they actually open everything that they receive in the email and, just carefully make sure that their email inbox always says 0 unread messages. And then there's other people in the world, people that I know well, who may have like tens of thousands of unread messages in their email inbox, right? So imagine a world where you send out an email survey, and in the survey you ask the question, do you read every email that you receive? Well, there's clearly going to be a non-response bias, because the people who do not read every email they receive are probably not going to read that email, right? So they are probably not responding. And so compared to the actual result that you would get from the whole population, this survey is going to be biased towards the yes responses, because these people who would answer yes probably did read and respond to the survey. Does that make sense? So it's not that you sampled the population incorrectly. It's just that some people chose to respond and some people chose not to respond. Likewise, if you were a consultant going around a workplace and you want to ask the employees of the workplace, do you feel overwhelmed at work? And, maybe as a way to respond to the survey, you give the employees some instructions, like if you feel overwhelmed at work or if you don't feel overwhelmed at work, please fill out this form and take it to the front desk and, drop it off before 5 p.m. today or something like this. The people who do feel overwhelmed at work may have too much to do while they're at work in order to have time to respond. So they're actually not going to respond to the survey if they feel overwhelmed and they have more important things to do. Whereas the people who do not feel overwhelmed at work, maybe they have free time during their day while they're at work, they actually might respond because, hey, they have the downtime in their day set aside to do that. So you might think about the way that you are, seeking out people, and see if your question that you're asking has anything to do with whether or not your sample is going to respond to your survey. And the best way to eliminate non-response bias would be to make sure that anyone you randomly sample and anyone you send the survey to actually does respond. So, for example, you could follow up with all of the employees at the company and make sure that the ones that were randomly sampled actually are responding and not just ignoring your survey. But following up takes work, and so that's not often done in practice. And finally, getting to our third type of bias, and there's a bunch of different fun types of response bias, but response bias means that you got a response from an individual, so it's not non-response, right? We actually did receive a response from an individual, but somehow the response itself is biased. So, for example, there have actually been studies, I believe, that show this, that just psychologically, if you choose to ask somebody what is your salary, people will generally inflate their salary when asked, right? So maybe someone actually makes, let's say, $40,000 a year, but if you ask them just point blank, what is your salary? People will generally inflate this, and so maybe they'll tell you that they make $50,000 a year, right? Because they want, they want to be perceived by other people as someone who is valuable or someone who makes a big income. They want other people to respect them and so forth. So there's motivations people have for inflating their salary when asked about it. And this effect somehow, it even persists when the survey is anonymous. So even if you tell people your response will be anonymous and they're filling out a form online, they're still likely to inflate their salary when asked. Same thing about how often do you exercise? Or, if you go to the dentist's office, and the dentist asks you how often do you floss, you're more likely to inflate that number and say, oh, I floss 3 times a week, even if in reality you only floss 1 time a week. And same thing about if you're asked how much do you weigh, people tend to underestimate this number, right? And so I had an experience maybe last year where I went to the doctor's office and they asked me, how much do you weigh? And I gave them a number that I really thought was correct. And then almost immediately after, they had me step on the scale, and the scale demonstrated that I actually did weigh about 5 to 10 pounds more than I believed in my head. So in general, when you ask these types of questions where people have emotions associated with the answer, they'll generally give you an answer that's not exactly correct, but is actually biased a little bit in favor of what they would prefer to be reality. Okay, so in this publication, which is Questions and Answers and Attitude Surveys, published in 1981, they asked a group of people, they asked a sample of individuals these 2 questions right here. Number 1, they asked, do you think the U.S. should forbid public speeches against democracy? And number 2, do you think the U.S. should allow public speeches against democracy? And to give you some context here, these 2 questions were sort of buried within a set of about 100 questions. And what happens if you ask someone 100 questions and you sneak in 2 questions that are pretty much related, or pretty much the same question? It's easy to forget, right? So if number 1 is the 14th question you're asked, and if number 2 is like the 97th question you're asked, then all those questions in between tend to sort of reset your memory. And so when they came across the second question, they don't necessarily remember that they answered the first, or how they answered the first question. So the interesting bit here is when they went to analyze the data, they found that for the first question, right here, 21.4% responded yes. And based on this response, we should expect something around 79% or 78.6% to respond. Let's see, I believe this is going to take me a moment to think about. If you responded yes to saying that the U.S. should forbid, then you should say no to the second. Right. So that means we should expect 21.4% to say no to question 2. But you can see what I wrote here. Actually, for question 2, we found that 47.8% responded no. So that actually, that contradicts our expectation. Let me just repeat that one more time. If you answered yes to question number 1, you think the U.S. should forbid public speeches, then basically for question 2, you do not think the U.S. should allow those same public speeches. So yes and no should be a pair of answers that always appears the same. And that means that no and yes should be a pair of answers that always appears with the same frequency. And what we found is 21.4 responded yes. That means that we should expect 21.4 to respond no to question 2. And in actuality, we found 47.8%. What we are trying to illustrate here is that the way you word a question actually matters. The way you word a question or phrase a question on a survey actually influences the results. And what this is sort of showing is that when you use the word allow, people are, well, heck, I don't even know what to conclude here, but you see that it's basically the same question but we actually, in changing the wording, we got a different response, right? Maybe the word forbid sounds too strong or something like this, and so people are less likely to respond yes to question number 1. Okay. As another example, if you're trying to give a bunch of people the survey that asks, do you oppose the legalization of marijuana? You're actually more likely to get yes answers to any yes or no question than no answers. So the way this question is worded, this is actually biased towards the yes response. People tend to answer yes more often than no. So if you ask, do you oppose the legalization of marijuana? You're going to get more yeses than the equivalent response if you were actually asking, do you favor or oppose the legalization of marijuana? And so we say that we should write it this way because we're actually stating both of your options. Or instead of just saying oppose, by saying favor or oppose, it's sort of giving both sides of the argument equal weight. So it's kind of silly maybe, but this is a more fair, more egalitarian way of conducting a survey where both sides get equal representation, you might say, in the question. Now on the next slide, I want to point out that it's actually, in addition to presenting both sides, favor or oppose or favor, it's actually best to scramble the order of the words. So what that means is half of the people surveyed, half of the individuals surveyed should get this one. They should receive a question that says, do you favor or oppose the legalization of marijuana? And then another randomly assigned half of the individuals should get the second question. In other words, half should get, do you oppose or favor? And by sort of randomizing who receives what question, and by flipping the order of those responses, it actually, again, makes this more fair and more egalitarian, because if you just have the possibilities in one particular order, like favor or oppose, it may be more biased towards the first option that the question states. It's also best to scramble the order of questions in a survey. So in the previous slide, I pointed out that it's best to scramble the order of words, but now we're talking about the order of questions that appear in a survey. For example, you might have a survey that asks multiple questions about politics, and so one of the questions might be, do you approve or disapprove of Joe Biden's decisions in Afghanistan? And this question is kind of dated because I'm thinking here about fall 2021. And, with the Afghanistan falling to the Taliban, I believe. Sorry, I'm not big into current events. But that was really unpopular. People were really definitely upset about this. And maybe in the same survey, you also want to ask the question, do you approve or disapprove of Joe Biden's job performance overall? Now, the order of these questions actually could influence the result of your survey. Because if you ask this question first and this question second, that would actually make you more likely to be biased to disapprove of his job performance overall. Whereas, if we flipped the order, and we ask this question first and this question second, this would be maybe a little bit more biased towards approve, because you're not bringing up a traumatic event into the forefront of people's minds. You're not reminding them of something really bad that happened during his presidency right before you ask about an overall approval rating. So basically, what I'm trying to say is the order of questions needs to be shuffled around so that some of the respondents or some of the individuals surveyed get the blue order, where you do the overall question first, and then the specific question second, And then maybe some individuals with a randomly scrambled set get the other opposite order, right? So it's best to scramble not only the order of words, but also the order of questions. And it's also best to scramble the order of answers in a survey. So on a more lighthearted note, maybe Mountain Dew is trying to ask its customers, people who drink Mountain Dew, what should be the next Mountain Dew flavor? And the possibilities that they're willing to produce are pineapple Mountain Dew, raspberry Mountain Dew, cherry Mountain Dew, and bubblegum Mountain Dew. Well, people are actually most likely to pick the first answer choice they read, and so we're biased toward picking A for a list of opinions, right? And so just to make sure that pineapple doesn't win by, nature of being placed first in the survey, each time someone receives one of these surveys, the order of the questions the order of the answers needs to be scrambled or randomized for each person, for each respondent. Just to make it fair for all of the possible answer choices. And these are ways to reduce what we call response bias. So again, just to remind you, response bias is when you get a response from an individual, but somehow it's biased.